Welcome back to today's special of all about Fisherian selection. We're going to continue the conversation that um, started with last week's sexual selection lectures. When we began this, we actually said there are four distinct hypotheses that have been used to explain the evolution of really complex signals, structures, morphologies in sexes as a result of mate choice. And those hypotheses were non-genetic benefits, pre-existing or sensory biases, good genes, and Fisherian runaway selection. We talked through the first three last week and then never got around to Fisherian runaway selection. So today is all about Fisherian. And this is a really fun and also sort of strangely complicated one that, or hypothesis that has been used to explain the evolution of really complex or sometimes really incredibly showy traits in organisms. But it has a fairly simple beginning. And the fairly simple beginning says this: there is, in a population, genetic variation within a beneficial male trait, a trait that provides some benefit in terms of survivorship, in terms of food handling capabilities or food acquisition, provides some benefit to a male. There is also within a population some genetic variation for female preference for that particular trait. Some females may prefer that trait in males. Some females may not have a preference for that trait. In the case where a female with a genetic preference copulates with, has offspring with a male who has that trait, then their offspring will inherit both the genes for the preference and the genes for the trait. If the offspring are male, then they will express the sex-specific gene. If the offspring are, well, they will express the trait. If the offspring are female, then they will express the preference. This is where it's like, ooh, well, that's not super complicated, and yet, ooh, what does this mean in practice? So let's look at sort of a weirdo example that I created for you. So here are characteristics in a male. There are two variants. And in this case, we're going to say the blue one is the male who has the better trait, the more beneficial trait, the trait that is more preferred. Here are two females in that population. In this case, we're going to say one of these females has a genetic preference for males with a particular trait, and one of these females has no preference. So what happens in a population where we get all these individuals together? All the same species within a single population, just genetic variation in males, genetic variation in females, different sets of traits. So here's a population. Bunch of males with the trait, bunch of males without that particular trait. These are the ones who have the trait that's beneficial. These are the ones who don't have that. Bunch of females in that population. These females have a preference for males with this trait. These females don't have a preference. So what happens then? Who mates with whom? And what do their offspring look like? Well, if these females all have a genetic preference for these males, then they will reject these green males as possible suitors, as possible parents of their offspring. And so these females will all mate with these blue males. What will these females do? Well, they don't have a preference. If they don't have a preference, then they will 50% of the time mate with these males and 50% of the time mate with these males because they're not expressing any preference at all. If they were expressing a preference for one or the other, then that's the ones they would primarily mate with. So what does this mean for the next generation in this population? Well, these individuals will have both the genes for the preference, this orange color, and the genes for the trait, the blue color, And so that's if they're males, then they will look blue. If they're females, then they will have preference for blue. But both traits exist in all of these offspring. What about in the offspring of the other females? Well, half of them, if they're will have either the preference, or no preference at all, but will have the trait for that is preferred. Half of them will not have a preference and will have the trait that is less preferred. But already, these individuals with this particular trait or trait combination are disappearing from the population. These individuals, the ones with the trait, are becoming more and more common in the population. Over time, what you then start to see is a linkage between these two genes, a linkage between the gene for the trait and the gene for the preference, and an increase in individuals with the trait, and over time, an increase in individuals with the preference. As time goes on, that male trait evolves through sexual selection by the female, and female preference evolves because it becomes linked to that male trait. If the preference is for a trait that is more costly, or variants or preferences for variants of the trait that are even more showy, then that can drive this trait to become more and more costly and elaborate, and take it out of the realm of being beneficial for survival and into the realm of just being an entirely sexually selected trait. What we call this sometimes is the idea of a supernormal stimulus. A supernormal stimulus. I'm reading the I'm reading the subtitles that are getting created, and apparently I said a supernormal stimulus. That's just funny. A supernormal stimulus is one that elicits a stronger response in an individual who sees it, even if it is more extreme than a normal trait. So if a female has a preference for large tails, and there's a male with a tail so large that it is bound to get him killed, a female still may prefer that one because it's super normal. It really elicits a very strong positive response from those females. And so Fisherian runaway selection, because it's connected to these genetic preferences, can really drive through this positive feedback loop the elaboration of really complex traits. And there you go. That is the fourth of these hypotheses related to the evolution of complex traits as a result of mate choice, as a result of intersexual selection. The next set of things will be all about intrasexual selection. See ya.